for our democracy, where citizens come together because they see their role as not just giving feedback passively through various feedback mechanisms, but really coming out and demanding certain things and putting their ideas proactively on the agenda for political parties to consider, as the election nears. I think this is a healthy thing for our society. I remember a time when civil society groups that did that was seen as straying into the political arena, and that was not seen as okay. So I'm glad that, as a society we've matured to the point where this is not just possible, but many people see that as desirable and healthy, and we should continue to progress in that way. I think when we think about Singapore, too often in the past, and maybe even today to some extent, we operate with a mental model that democracy is sort of like Plato's philosopher king, that democracy should be about the people giving their trust to elites, and maybe, the elites have a certain amount of accountability at the ballot box to prevent them from becoming corrupt or going too extreme. But, basically, the people delegate a lot to these elites who govern in our best interest because they have technocratic skills that apparently the rest of us and the mass of people don't have. So I think, we have to get away from that model towards a model of a participatory democracy like what we are seeing here, and in so many other ways. And for example, I recently met someone who founded a group of businesses, companies actually, brought them together to negotiate with the government during COVID, outside of the framework of the traditional trade associations and chambers, because they were pressing needs, and he organized several hundred of them, close to 1,000, and they actually managed to achieve some of the things that they had set out to achieve. So this is really the way to go, and I think the elite technocratic model of democracy is not fit for purpose when we look at the challenges Singapore is going to be facing as we go forward. We are going to be increasingly tested by geopolitical tensions. You all know the Gerasimov doctrine, that foreign powers come and actually disrupt politics to achieve military ends. We are going to be disrupted economically by many, many technological trends and artificial intelligence and so on and so forth. So to withstand all these pressures, we need to have political, social, economic outcomes in our society that everyone buys into. This high degree of public ownership, public participation in all these outcomes, rather than outcomes being decided by elites who just take feedback, and people are supposed to give trust to the elites. You often hear this term that what we want is the people to trust. But trust has to be earned. Trust should not be expected to be given in that manner. I'll talk basically about the strategies that I think civil society groups and activists and parties need to do. Clearly, and I know I'm working on the time constraint here, so you can stop me if I'm, So clearly there is a middle group, right? When we talk about Singaporeans, the electorate, the people, there is a middle group that is perhaps less politically invested, maybe less politically literate to some extent, but they have views and they have lived experiences, and the key is really reaching out to this group who don't necessarily have fixed opinions about things, and winning them over. And it's a key challenge, I think, both for parties and for civil society groups to develop the skills to reach out to this broad middle effectively. And we do hear a lot of talk about defending the center. This is a narrative I've heard very often, that we have to avoid the political polarization and fracturing that we see in other countries. We have to defend the center, because we don't want what happened in France, what happened in the US, and I expect we will see this narrative a lot more in the next few months. But I think the point about the center is that center can also evolve and change, and that job of evolving the center of gravity of politics is really down to people who are active in politics and civil society. For example, if you look at the issue of migrant workers, I would say over the last 30, 40 years, the political center, the public opinion center has evolved a lot towards a much greater degree of support for rights and welfare for the migrant workers that we have, compared to what you saw maybe 30, 40 years ago. And I think that is to a very large extent, in fact it's entirely, I think, the work of activists and civil society groups, and some political parties have contributed to that as well. So in order to be effective at that, I think there are many things that need to be done. We need to create human stories about the changes that we want to see. We need to refer to events that happen that can galvanize public opinion. That's important. And obviously using social media, using research as a tool, and I think especially when appealing to the middle ground, facts and figures, well-researched papers like what you have here are very effective in reaching out to people who don't necessarily have a fixed opinion but can be persuaded intellectually. And if you take a lead from political parties, what a lot of parties do is they walk around the markets, so coffee shops, and directly talk to people, one person at a time. And I think that is arduous work. It's not easy to get up early in the morning and walk around, a coffee shop for 3 hours. But that does yield dividends over time if you're willing to play the long game and you're willing to reach out in that manner. So I think just to wrap up, I know I'm probably running out of time, but I would just want to end off with one thought. I think those of us who want to see change and progress for our democracy, we have to make sure that if we are able to play that long game and to have that latitude and that space to advocate independently, it's very important for us to also develop another set of skills, and that's fundraising skills, to have the ability to raise independent funds rather than to be dependent on the state for your funds. Because if you are not able to do that, then it becomes actually very, very difficult now, and I'm sure all of you can resonate with that. Okay, I think I will leave it at there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leon. I think
who have been holding the fort in the labor movement with the migrant workers and all, they're all in the audience, and also workers themselves who are here who have been doing such great work, trying to organize against significant odds, right? I think salute to all of them, and I dedicate what I have to say to them today. I'm actually wondering, Marcus, is there a slide to show the title of the panel? Is that there? No. No, Okay, it's fine. I can talk about it. I'll stand. That's okay. Yeah. Okay. So for at least 6 years of our lives, Monday to Friday, we, the citizens of Singapore, pledge to build a democratic society based on justice and equality, so as to achieve happiness, prosperity, and progress for our nation. Yet, in my view, the ruling elite in this country has actively sought to derail, disrupt, and destroy any prospect of a truly functioning democratic society. But first, what is democracy? Democracy comes from the Greek words demos and kratos, where demos means people and kratos means power. So democracy means people power. Some scholars online, however, have a different view. You can see them on Facebook. They say that it comes from the Singlish phrase kaupe kaubu. Now, if democracy means people power, is voting for your political representative once every 5 years important for democracy to function? Yes or no? Yes. Yes, right? Yeah. But is this sufficient for you to feel empowered? No. We have Meet the People sessions, we have feedback forms, feedback sessions, closed-door consultations with people in power if you're lucky, or important enough. What we are given is not democracy. What we are given are channels to participate on their terms. Democracy must be defined as more than just participative channels. Feedback sessions have no teeth, and very often we have no idea what happens to our feedback once we submit it. It's a black hole. I propose that we define democracy as the space available for ordinary people like you and I to engage the people in power on our terms without fear of penalty. Do you agree with me? Yes! Now we have the potential of such a democracy built by a people's movement from the ground up. And there are many examples of how the ruling elite has destroyed these prospects of genuine democracy in Singapore. Allow me to share just two of the many examples I can think of. First, they derailed democracy at the workplace. Singapore had a very vibrant labor movement since the 1950s. This was the same labor movement that was essential for the PAP's rise. Once they came into power, however, they captured the workers' unions under the PAP-controlled NTUC, and soon laws were put in put in place to significantly tighten restrictions on unions going on strike. Since the 80s, let me ask you, have you heard of a legal strike in Singapore? No. My friends, does this mean that you have no problems at work?
No.
Migrant workers have it even worse. Even though workers are entitled to report any workplace grievances to MOM, there are many cases of workers who are terminated and sent back to their home country once they lodge a complaint. This is for exercising their legal right. But hey, authorities do engage workers, right? Let me share with you a personal experience. When I was a food delivery rider, I participated in a Kopi session with the NDCA, which is the NTUC-led Association for Food Delivery Riders. The session was meant to hear riders' views on the government's intention to make CPF contributions mandatory. There were 5 or 6 riders in the session with me, and I remember hearing a consensus that the riders were welcoming of CPF contributions being introduced, but that it should not be made mandatory. However, the NDCA staff present kept trying to convince us about the benefits of it being mandatory. I tried to explain to her where we were coming from, and after a while another rider told me, "Hey bro, don't bother. She has no power. Someone else has already made up their mind." And then the rider gestured to the staff, "Correct or not?" And the staff nodded her head. Secondly, in my view, the government is actively killing our democracy with their heavy-handed responses to criticism. Someone mentioned POFMA earlier. They are running amok with POFMA. Just a few days ago, a property agent, Sheikh Amar for short, was issued a POFMA correction order by MND for expressing his views that the ethnic integration policy had no benefits to ethnic minorities. He was POFMA for saying that, and saying that the EIP was there since the 1960s when it was only there since 1989. But why was there a need to POFMA him? Many mainstream media news outlets published this, and in the comment sections, people were tagging his employer. It seems like it's not just the cost of living that has gone up, the cost of speaking up has gone up. Now, for getting a date wrong and not wording your opinion properly, you can potentially lose your job. With the way POFMA is being exercised, what happened to Amar can happen to anyone here in this room. And what about the ridiculous barriers doing anything about the ongoing genocide in Palestine that is not on their terms? Since October last year, no rallies about Palestine could be held at Hong Lim Park. I had tried to book exactly this venue for an event about Palestine, but instead I received a call from the police saying that I would need a permit, which they said they would not give. The event had to be cancelled, of course. Peacefully walking with watermelon umbrellas to deliver letters to the Istana is also not allowed, it seems. It may cause chaos and disorder. That was not allowed, but an air show showcasing weapons of mass child murder was allowed to take place. But despite these serial assaults against our democracy, people have risen up and practiced democracy on their terms regardless. Let me give you 2 examples of people practicing democracy, Singapore style. In 2019, then Minister Lam Pin Min announced that PMDs would be banned overnight. Did anybody remember that? In response, food delivery riders who relied on the PMD for their livelihood put up an unprecedented mobilization effort for 9 days to try and reverse the ban. Instead of expecting a formal channel from the government to open up, the riders expressed their grievances with the ban on their terms. They did it creatively, going to the Meet the People sessions in massive groups and effectively turning a one-to-one session with the MP into a town hall where all riders could be heard. Overnight. Yes, give them a round of applause, please. Overnight, a group of workers whose views were hardly ever listened to grabbed headlines. They lost the battle, but they won the war. Sure, they didn't manage to reverse the PMD ban, but the NDCA was formed shortly after, and riders' views began to be heard more proactively by the public and authorities. There was a sharp increase in government efforts to hear the riders' views. Lam Pin Min even lost his seat in Sengkang in the general election, which happened a few months later. And remember the CPF issue I was talking about? After significant pushback from riders, including a public statement was very popular, the government relaxed the policy. Do you see what happens when we practice democracy on our terms? Democracy on our terms delivers the goods. Second example, around that time, 13 bus drivers sued SBS for systematically underpaying all of their overtime wages. Previously, the drivers had tried to engage the NTUC union and SBS privately, but none of this bore any fruit. The drivers decided that it was time to escalate the matter to the courts. They earned so much public support. However, that could not stop SBS from eventually firing all 13 workers. Years later, the drivers sadly lost the lawsuit. However, just months after the judgment, the existing SBS bus drivers received a new contract with much better terms. The overtime issue they had complained about was now fixed, and all 6,000 drivers were given a $300 to $500 raise per month. Let me give them a round of applause. Democracy on our terms delivers the goods. There are many other examples of people practicing democracy on their terms in very creative ways. From students, public rental flat tenants, to migrant workers, and many others. Too much for me to get into this sharing. And I'm sure I've already went past my time. But you can follow Workers Make Possible on Instagram to find out more. Is it not abundantly clear that democracy is rooted in our history and our present? Democracy on our terms is as Singaporean as chicken rice. And clearly it is capable, dare I say integral, to serving people their bread and butter. There is no such thing as democracy being separate from the bread and butter. But we need to understand very clearly that although the people in power demand we pledge to build a democratic society, they don't have an interest in building one for us. When we recite this pledge, we need to understand that only ordinary people can build a democratic society. Historically, anywhere in the world, no government in power has ever handed down democracy to its people. We, the workers, the people, the ordinary people of Singapore, will never ever win our democracy on the ruling party's terms. To believe that democracy is possible on the PAP's terms is naive, dare I say, idealistic. If we cherish our rice bowls, our bread and butter, and that of others, then we must not merely talk about democracy, cakap democracy. We must practice it in our everyday lives. Buat democracy. This is the pragmatic thing to do. I am confident that the more we practice democracy on our terms, Singapore will turn into an actual democracy. This manifesto is an example of practicing democracy on our terms. These are our demands as 32 grassroots groups. We ask that the political parties listen to them carefully as they draft their manifestos. After all, it is not the people in power, but we, the people, who pledge to build a democratic society. Thank you very much.
And I'm from Singapore Youth for Climate Action. I just want to thank the organizers for inviting me to be part of this panel. I will say also that when I first started out environmental work 7 years ago, I had no interest in politics, democracy or any of that. I had just a very simplistic and idealistic mindset. I just wanted to do environmental work and my interest was just solely about environmentalism. And I just had the idea that as long as we had sufficient individual level action and put them together, the world will change. And I guess this is also reflective of the same narrative that we have grown up with instilled into us since our childhood, that as long as we put together sufficient individual level action, things will change. And I think over time, as I began to dig further and further and learn more about the root causes of environmental issues and the big ones also that we are witnessing overseas, climate change and everything, I began to question why is it that despite our laborious campaigning work done by me, my predecessors and by all the different organizations, despite technological advancements in our society, locally and worldwide and everywhere, the environment isn't getting better, but in many cases, declining. For example, we have known that for the past 10 years, the Semakau landfill is running out of space by 2035, yet waste production continues to increase over the years. We are told to recycle more, yet even with higher consumer awareness, domestic recycling rates are dropping over the years. And since I was a child, I was told that we need to use less energy, save electricity, and yet national energy consumption increases every year. There are so many contradictions, I can go on forever, between what we were told was the problem and solution versus what we suspected was the actual problem and solution. And as a teenager back then, it didn't make sense to me. As a young adult today, it still doesn't. And so overall, I realized that there were a lot of questions that I could not answer by simply looking at the environmental lens alone. I've come to learn also that the main contention around many different environmental issues is not so much about the problem out there exists. Rather, the contention lies on what we should do to solve the problem, and this differs among many different stakeholders, government, industry, and so on. And so I came to realize that the solution, real solutions to environmental issues, are fundamentally linked to democratic principles. One well-known principle of environmental justice is, quote, the right to participate as equal partners at every level of decision-making, including needs assessment, planning, implementation, enforcement, and evaluation. In essence, at every stage of the whole process, before, during, and after. This means that we need to engage different groups in society with a particular emphasis on those who are usually not present in decision-making processes, like the marginalized, vulnerable, poor, migrant workers, and more. We need to engage groups, diverse groups with different theories of change. And I think especially in today's context, when we talk about what is a just transition, we need to bear in mind who is often the ones that are most vulnerable to environmental disaster and environmental pollution. And this eventually leads us back to the question of, are there sufficient accessible channels for all of us to share our feedback and grievances? Are there sufficient channels to make our voices heard? And particularly for Singapore, historically, environmental solutions and environmental spaces have traditionally been very elite-driven. I'm not saying that all of them entirely don't work. It's just that we need to always question to how far they can be effective in promoting the kind of society that we want. Like specifically for climate matters, for example, I'm less confident that elite solutions are the way to go. We have seen, like for example, in 2022, when Singapore announced that it was going to go net zero, a lot of people started cheering, saying that it is a victory. But actually, I see it as a long overdue thing, because Singapore is actually one of the last few countries in the world to declare net zero by 2050, and it doesn't seem to me that we can just purely rely on a small group of people to make a good decision, the ideal decisions that we need for our climate. And also, we've been calling for many years on the carbon tax allowances, understanding more carbon tax allowances that has been given to the industry, but was only recently reported through a Reuters article that actually Singapore was offering refiners and petrochemical companies rebates of up to 76%, which we didn't previously know before. And then we see most recently last week, the delays for the third time in the implementation of the beverage container return scheme, and which I suspected was due to industry pressure. So you can see many different cases that when decision-making spaces are left to just a small group of people, that can result in the outcomes that are not necessarily always good for the environment. And similarly, at environmental and climate conferences, we consistently see how elite-only spaces are delaying and obstructing the negotiations. And also on the note of how the government sets the terms of engagement, I think it is true that there are many different new spaces that are popping up over the years on how to engage with the government. Like for example, speaking in policymakers, they may invite you to closed-door sessions, or they may invite you can invite them to representatives of them to our workshops and events as attendees or speakers, exchange views at panel discussions, and more. So I'm very thankful that there are many different ways, but yet I think there are two main issues that often arise. One is that some groups are invited, some are not. For example, in closed-door engagements, we see the exclusion of certain groups despite the same level of work that they do in advocacy spaces. And second is that sometimes the topic can be very narrowly crafted to something that they decided that it is the issue, and just goes back to my earlier point on how they decide that what is the problem and what is the solution, rather than something that is ground up. And overall, I think I also express my deeper worry that environmental civil society at large in Singapore is becoming more elitist, where everyone wants to climb their way to higher level positions and get their foot in closed door sessions. And my personal opinion is that the environmental movement in Singapore can be quite fragmented. And so I feel that if we really want to make a stronger people's movement, we also need to connect and collaborate more with each other across all levels of the advocacy spectrum and respect each other's position in the ecosystem, the decisions we make in advocacy, the unique role that each of us plays. And yeah, when we put aside our differences, we can also realize that we are more similar than we thought we were. Thank you.
Can be narrowly crafted to limit the discussion, and then it becomes closed door. So under the ethical approach of closed door, how much can you share publicly? So with that, I will now come to this bigger question of how is our space increasing, picking up a little bit from what Kumarr has raised, that it is up to us, he has put forward, to carve out our space. Yet he also mentioned quite strongly there is, to quote unquote, serial assaults, which I think is a fascinating term, serial assaults by the state on individuals. So I would like to hear from Kumarr first. What is the impact of that on the work that one wants to take forward? Because you do have a belief on an issue, or how that issue is going to be of service to the betterment of people or the planet. I'll come back to you in a while, Leon. Yes, Kumarr.
Hello? Yeah. I think my response to that is the answer. Like, I mean, it's the fact that I need to even caveat that and say, like, it is my opinion, it is not a statement of fact, right? Because the recent POFMA orders have been quite alarming. Things that we would usually think are opinions, if they're not explicit that, oh, this is my opinion, I'm saying that the EIP is not beneficial to minorities, you can get into trouble. So I have to say, oh, it is my opinion that it is a serial assault on democracy, right? And so, like, I think it does really cause a lot of self-censorship. Just drafting the manifesto, like, everyone was for good measure, were mindful, like, is this POFMA-able? I think the number of comments that actually said, we need to cite this, otherwise, it might be a POFMA risk. So I think it's like a minefield. It's But I think for me, right, how I navigate this is I just refer to my peers who are a bit more experienced in navigating this. And I think the question I usually ask myself is, what can I do or what can be done to allow me to take this risk? Because, like I said, I think democracy is something that we have to struggle for. There's no democracy in the world that has not come out of struggle. Right? If you look at Malaysia, for example, 2018, that election was very important. I think it was 2018. Yeah, that election was based on years of reformasi, Bersih, the movement, the groundswell that happened, and people lost their jobs. People were even killed. So many things have happened. And so for me, what I think about is that the moment that there's no one who are willing to take those risks, we're in deep trouble. Authoritarianism will increase, will expand, and we may not even have this event. We might have to apply a permit, God knows, right? So I think like what I want to stress is it's important to defend our democracy and expand the democracy, and this will result in a lot of risks. But I think when we come together as a community, with elders, with our peers, we can find ways to mitigate that risk. We can find ways to, hey, you know what? Okay, if like there is a fine that's attached to this, like, okay, what am I willing to absorb that fine? If people are willing to help with that, for example, yeah. So I think that's how I would answer that.
Thank you, Leon. To leap off from what you shared, that there are more legislation has been put forward in the more recent years. And just to cite POFMA, the last time I read it, and this is public, not guesswork, that there were 74 POFMAs that were issued in the time period, by the time period of November 2023, right? And there was no POFMA on the number, so I assume that the number is correct, right? So the question is, taking off from what Kumarr also said, how do we increase the space when there is this level of restriction, and also a little bit more about, as an opposition politician, raising quite a lot of pertinent issues in the public, from within Parliament to outside within the people sector and the civil society sector. You have traversed all three zones. How do you think one could go about increasing that space, knowing that there is a chance of something coming at you in terms of legislation?
I think the first thing to note is that I do believe there has been some progress. I think in the past, as I mentioned, if you go back to the 80s and the 90s, even the view of the establishment was that civil society groups cannot be so active advocating on policy because they're crossing into the political arena. So now I think everyone accepts that it's perfectly legitimate for ordinary citizens, civil society groups, professional groups to express policy opinions, to call for policy changes. So that's a good thing, but it's only as good as how well we can make use of that, how well we can harness that to drive for changes. So I think to address your question, the first thing that we need to do if we want to push for changes is to not make it so easy for them, basically. We have to be very mindful of the existing laws and restrictions and try and navigate around those. So I think Koki also was referring to this in her speech about being fastidious, about having references, footnotes, research, making sure you're POFMA proof, defamation proof. So everything, if you're in the space, whether you're an opposition party, whether you're a civil society organization, you have to do this process. You have to have someone with some legal training go through for defamation proofing, right? Which you don't really get in many other democracies, but in our democracy you have to do that. So if you have to do that, you have to do that if you really want to be effective and you want to bring about change. And I think it is possible to be compliant with these things and still make the point and still push for changes. It's more difficult, no doubt, but I think these are the skills and competencies that we need. In relation to spanning civil society and opposition, I think you had a question there. I think we've seen some evolution. So certainly when I was an MP, it was really a privilege for me back then to engage with civil society groups and to take some of those ideas and frame them into parliamentary interventions, parliamentary questions, adjournment motions, and things of that nature. So that's very, very healthy, and that I think for activists, those kind of relationships need to be cultivated. I think not all MPs would be open to really doing that, but I think some are. Hopefully that number increases. And again, it comes back to this ability to shape and the ability to influence the middle ground, right? When we talk about the center, I think if we are effective as activists or parties to push for change, we need to be effective in mobilizing that center ground and making them think a little bit more and winning them over using all these various techniques, your social media, your groundwork, your research, and so on and so forth. And I think we will find that if we are effective at doing that, the politicians will naturally come, because politicians have to listen to their constituents. So if their constituents are asking those questions and expressing those views to them, they will naturally come. So I think the question of engaging MPs is not just about creating the supply, but also creating the demand. And I think if you're effective in influencing public opinion, you'll find it much easier to engage more and more MPs.